Preface to the first edition of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester, 2007. Principles of Economics, an introductory volume, by Alfred Marshall. Natura non facit saltum. Preface to the first edition. Economic conditions are constantly changing, and each generation looks at its own problems in its own way. In England, as well as on the continent and in America, economic studies are being more vigorously pursued now than ever before, but all this activity has only shown the more clearly that economic science is, and must be, one of slow and continuous growth. Some of the best work of the present generation has indeed appeared at first sight to be antagonistic to that of earlier writers, but when it has had time to settle down into its proper place, and its rough edges have been worn away, it has been found to involve no real breach of continuity in the development of the science. The new doctrines have supplemented the older, have extended, developed, and sometimes corrected them, and often have given them a different tone by a new distribution of emphasis, but very seldom have subverted them. The present treatise is an attempt to present a modern version of old doctrines with the aid of the new work, and with reference to the new problems of our own age. Its general scope and purpose are indicated in Book 1, at the end of which a short account is given of what are taken to be the chief subjects of economic inquiry, and the chief practical issues on which that inquiry has a bearing. In accordance with the English traditions, it is held that the function of the science is to collect, arrange, and analyse economic facts, and to apply the knowledge gained by observation and experience in determining what are likely to be the immediate and ultimate effects of various groups of causes, and it is held that the laws of economics are statements of tendencies expressed in the indicative mood, and not ethical precepts in the imperative. Economic laws and reasonings, in fact, are merely a part of the material which conscience and common sense have to turn to account in solving practical problems, and in laying down rules which may be a guide in life. But ethical forces are among those of which the economist has to take account. Attempts have indeed been made to construct an abstract science with regard to the actions of an economic man, who is under no ethical influences, and who pursues pecuniary gain warily and energetically, but mechanically and selfishly. But they have not been successful, nor even thoroughly carried out, for they have never really treated the economic man as perfectly selfish. No one could be relied on better to endure toil and sacrifice with the unselfish desire to make provision for his family, and his normal motives have always been tacitly assumed to include the family affections. But if they include these, why should they not include all other altruistic motives, the action of which is so far uniform in any class at any time and place that it can be reduced to a general rule? There seems to be no reason, and in the present book normal action is taken to be that which may be expected under certain conditions from the members of an industrial group, and no attempt is made to exclude the influence of any motives the action of which is regular merely because they are altruistic. If the book has any special character of its own, that may perhaps be said to lie in the prominence which it gives to this and other applications of the principle of continuity. This principle is applied not only to the ethical quality of the motives by which a man may be influenced in choosing his ends, but also to the sagacity, the energy, and the enterprise with which he pursues those ends. Thus stress is laid on the fact that there is a continuous graduation from the actions of city men, which are based on deliberate and far-reaching calculations, and are executed with vigour and ability, to those of ordinary people who have neither the power nor the will to conduct their affairs in a business-like way. The normal willingness to save, the normal willingness to undergo a certain exertion for a certain pecuniary reward, or the normal alertness to seek the best markets in which to buy and sell, or to search out the most advantageous occupation for oneself or for one's children, all these and similar phrases must be relative to the members of a particular class at a given place and time. But When that is once understood, the theory of normal value is applicable to the actions of the unbusinesslike classes in the same way, though not with the same precision of detail, as those of the merchant or banker. And there is no sharp line of division between the conduct which is normal and that which has to be provisionally neglected as abnormal. So there is none between normal values and current or market or occasional values. The latter are those values in which the accidents of the moment exert a preponderating influence, while normal values are those which would be ultimately attained if the economic conditions under view had time to work out undisturbed their full effect. But there is no impassable gulf between these two. They shade into one another by continuous gradations. The values which we may regard as normal, if we were thinking of the changes from hour to hour on a produce exchange, do but indicate current variations with regard to the year's history, and the normal values with reference to the year's history are but current values with reference to the history of the century. For the element of time, which is the centre of the chief difficulty of almost every economic problem, is itself absolutely continuous. Nature knows no absolute partition of time into long periods and short, but the two shade into one another by imperceptible gradations, and what is a short period for one problem is a long period for another. Thus, for instance, the greater part, though not the whole, of the distinction between rent and interest on capital turns on the length of the period which we have in view. That which is rightly regarded as interest on free or floating capital, or on new investments of capital, is more properly treated as a sort of rent, a quasi-rent it is called below, on old investments of capital. And there is no sharp line of division between floating capital and that which has been sunk for a special branch of production, nor between new and old investments of capital. Each group shades into the other gradually, and thus even the rent of land is seen not as a thing by itself, but as the leading species of a large genus, though indeed it has peculiarities of its own, which are of vital importance from the point of view of theory as well as of practice. Again, though, there is a sharp line of division between man himself and the appliances which he uses, and though the supply of and the demand for human efforts and sacrifices have peculiarities of their own, which do not attach to the supply of and the demand for material goods, yet, after all, these material goods are themselves generally the result of human efforts and sacrifices. The theories of the values of labour and of the things made by it cannot be separated. They are parts of one great whole, and what differences there are between them, even in matters of detail, turn out on inquiry to be for the most part differences of degree rather than of kind. As, in spite of the general differences in form between birds and quadrupeds, there is one fundamental idea running through all their frames, so the general theory of the equilibrium of demand and supply is a fundamental idea running through the frames of all the various parts of the central problems of distribution and exchange. Footnote. In the Economics of Industry, published by my wife and myself in 1879, an endeavour was made to show the nature of this fundamental unity. A short provisional account of the relations of demand and supply was given before the theory of distribution, and then this one scheme of general reasoning was applied in succession to the earnings of labour, the interest on capital, and the earnings of management. But the drift of this arrangement was not made sufficiently clear, and on Professor Nicholson's suggestion more prominence has been given to it in the present volume. End footnote. Another application of the principle of continuity is to the use of terms. There has always been a temptation to classify economic goods in clearly defined groups, about which a number of short and sharp propositions could be made to gratify at once the student's desire for logical precision and the popular liking for dogmas that have the air of being profound and are yet easily handled. But great mischief seems to have been done by yielding to this temptation and drawing broad artificial lines of division where nature has made none. The more simple and absolute an economic doctrine is, the greater will be the confusion which it brings into attempts to apply economic doctrines to practice, if the dividing lines to which it refers cannot be found in real life. There is not in real life a clear line of division between things that are and are not capital, or that are and are not necessaries, or again between labour that is and is not productive. The notion of continuity with regard to development is common to all modern schools of economic thought, whether the chief influences acting on them are those of biology, as represented by the writings of Herbert Spencer, or of history and philosophy, as represented by Hegel's Philosophy of History, and by more recent ethico-historical studies on the continent and elsewhere. These two kinds of influences have affected, more than any other, the substance of the views expressed in the present book, but their form has been most affected by mathematical conceptions of continuity as represented in Cournot's Principes mathématiques de la théorie des richesses. He taught that it is necessary to face the difficulty of regarding the various elements of an economic problem not as determining one another in a chain of causation, A determining B, B determining C, and so on, but as mutually determining one another. Nature's action is complex, and nothing is gained in the long run by pretending that it is simple, and trying to describe it in a series of elementary propositions. Under the guidance of Cournot, and in a less degree of von Thunen, I was led to attach great importance to the fact that our observations of nature, in the moral as in the physical world, relate not so much to aggregate quantities as to increments of quantities, and in particular that the demand for a thing is a continuous function of which the marginal increment is in stable equilibrium balanced against the corresponding increment of its cost of production. Footnote. The term marginal increment I borrowed from von Thunen's De Isolerte Staat, 1826–63, and is now commonly used by German economists. When Jevons' theory appeared, I adopted his word final, but I have been gradually convinced that marginal is the better. End footnote. It is not easy to get a clear full view of continuity in this aspect without the aid either of mathematical symbols or of diagrams. The use of the latter requires no special knowledge, and they often express the conditions of economic life more accurately as well as more easily than do mathematical symbols, and therefore they have been applied as the supplementary illustrations in the footnotes of the present volume. The argument in the text is never dependent on them, and they may be omitted, but experience seems to show that they give a firmer grasp of many important principles than can be got without their aid, and that there are many problems of pure theory which no one who has once learnt to use diagrams will willingly handle in another way. The chief use of pure mathematics in economic questions seems to be in helping a person to write down quickly, shortly, and exactly some of his thoughts for his own use, and to make sure that he has enough, and only enough, premises for his conclusions, i.e. that his equations are neither more nor less in number than his unknowns. But when a great many symbols have to be used, they become very laborious to anyone but the writer himself. And though Cournot's genius must give a new mental activity to everyone who passes through his hands, and mathematicians of calibre similar to his may use their favourite weapons in clearing a way for themselves to the centre of some of those difficult problems of economic theory of which only the outer fringe has yet been touched, yet it seems doubtful whether anyone spends his time well in reading lengthy translations of economic doctrines into mathematics that have not been made by himself. A few specimens of those applications of mathematical language which have proved most useful for my own purposes have, however, been added in an appendix. September 1890. End of the preface to the first edition.
Preface to the 8th edition of Principles of Economics, Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 1. Preface to the 8th edition. This edition is a reprint of the 7th, which was almost a reprint of the 6th, the only changes being in small matters of detail. The preface is almost the same as in the 7th edition. It is now 30 years since the first edition of this book implied a promise that a second volume, completing the treatise, would appear within a reasonable time. But I had laid my plan on too large a scale, and its scope widened, especially on the realistic side, with every pulse of that industrial revolution of the present generation, which has far outdone the changes of a century ago, in both rapidity and breadth of movement. So, ere long, I was compelled to abandon my hope of completing the work in 2 volumes. My subsequent plans were changed more than once, partly by the course of events, partly by my other engagements, and the decline of my strength. Industry and Trade, published in 1919, is in effect a continuation of the present volume. A third, on Trade, Finance, and the Industrial Future, is far advanced. The 3 volumes are designed to deal with the chief problems of economics, so far as the writer's power extends. The present volume therefore remains as a general introduction to the study of economic science, similar in some respects, though not all, to that of volumes on foundations, Grundlagen, which Rajcher and some other economists have put in the forefront of groups of semi-independent volumes on economics. It avoids such special topics as currency and the organization of markets, and, in regards to such matters as structure of industry, employment, and the problem of wages, it deals mainly with normal conditions. Economic evolution is gradual. Its progress is sometimes arrested or reversed by political catastrophes. But its forward movements are never sudden, for even in the Western world and in Japan it is based on habit, partly conscious, partly unconscious. And though an inventor or an organizer or a financier of genius may seem to have modified the economic structure of a people almost at a stroke, yet that part of his influence, which has not been merely superficial and transitory, is found on inquiry to have done little more than bring to head a broad constructive movement, which had long been in preparation. Those manifestations of nature which occur most frequently, and are so orderly that they can be closely watched and narrowly studied, are the basis of economic as of most other scientific work, while those that are spasmodic, infrequent, and difficult of observation are commonly reserved for special examination at a later stage, and the motto Natura non facit saltum is specially appropriate to a volume on economic foundations. An illustration of this contrast may be taken from the distribution of the study of large businesses between the present volume and that on industry and trade. When any branch of industry offers an open field for new firms which rise to the first rank, and perhaps after a time decay, the normal cost of production in it can be estimated with reference to a representative firm, which enjoys a fair share both of those internal economies which belong to a well-organized individual business, and of those general or external economies which arise out of the collective organization of the district as a whole. A study of such a firm belongs properly in a volume on foundations. So also does a study of the principles on which a firmly established monopoly in the hands of a government department or large railway regulates its prices, with main reference indeed to its own revenue, but also with a more or less consideration for the well-being of its customers. But normal action falls into the background when trusts are striving for the mastery of a large market, when communities of interest are being made and unmade, and, above all, when the policy of any particular establishment is likely to be governed, not with a single eye to its own business success, but in subordination of some large stock exchange maneuver, or some campaign for the control of markets. Such matters cannot be fitly discussed in a volume on foundations. They belong to a volume dealing with some part of the superstructure. The mecca of the economist lies in economic biology rather than in economic dynamics. But biological conceptions are more complex than those of mechanics. A volume on foundations must therefore give a relatively large place to mechanical analogies, and frequent use is made of the term equilibrium, which suggests something of a statical analogy. This fact, combined with the predominant attention paid in the present volume to the normal conditions of life in the modern age, has suggested the notion that its central idea is statical rather than dynamical. But in fact it is concerned throughout with the forces that cause movement, and its keynote is that of dynamics rather than statics.
The forces to be dealt with are, however, so numerous that it is best to take a few at a time, and to work out a number of partial solutions as auxiliaries to our main study. Thus we begin by isolating the primary relations of supply, demand, and price in regard to a particular commodity. We reduce to inaction all other forces by the phrase "other things being equal." We do not suppose that they are inert, but for the time we ignore their activity. This scientific device is a great deal older than science. It is the method by which, consciously or unconsciously, sensible men have dealt from time immemorial with every difficult problem of ordinary life. In the second stage, more forces are released from the hypothetical slumber that had been imposed on them. Changes in the conditions of demand for and supply of particular groups of commodities come into play, and their complex mutual interactions begin to be observed. Gradually, the area of the dynamical problem becomes larger, the area covered by provisional statical assumptions becomes smaller, and at last is reached the greater central problem of the distribution of the national dividend among a vast number of different agents of production. Meanwhile, the dynamical principle of substitution is seen ever at work, causing the demand for and the supply of any one set of agents of production to be influenced through indirect channels by the movements of demand and supply in relation to other agents, even though situated in far remote fields of the industry. The main concern of economics is thus with human beings who are impelled, for good and evil, to change and progress. Fragmentary statical hypotheses are used as temporary auxiliaries to dynamical, or rather biological conceptions, but the central idea of economics, even when its foundations alone are under discussion, must be that of living force and movement. There have been stages in social history in which the special features of the income yielded by the ownership of land have dominated human relations, and perhaps they may again assert a preeminence. But in the present age, the opening out of new countries, aided by low transport charges on land and sea, has almost suspended the tendency to diminishing return, in that sense in which the term was used by Malthus and Ricardo, when English labourers' weekly wages were often less than the price of half a bushel of good wheat. And yet, if the growth of population should continue for very long, even at a quarter of its present rate, the aggregate rental values of land for all its uses, assumed to be as free as now from restraint by public authority, may again exceed the aggregate of incomes derived from all other forms of material property, even though that may then embody 20 times as much labor as now. Increasing stress has been laid in successive editions up to the present on these facts, and also on the correlated fact that in every branch of production and trade there is margin, up to which an increased application of any agent will be profitable under given conditions, but beyond which its further application will yield a diminishing return, unless there be some increase of demand accompanied by an appropriate increase of other agents of production needed to cooperate with it. And a similar increasing stress has been laid on the complementary fact that this notion of a margin is not uniform and absolute. It varies with the conditions of the problem in hand, and in particular with the period of time to which reference is being made. The rules are universal that 1. Marginal costs do not govern price. 2. It is only at the margin that the actions of those forces which do govern price can be made to stand out in clear light. And 3. The margin, which must be studied in reference to long periods and enduring results, differs in character as well as in extent from that which must be studied in reference to short periods and to passing fluctuations. Variations in the nature of marginal costs are indeed largely responsible for the well-known fact that those effects of an economic cause which are not easily traced are frequently more important than, and in opposite direction to, those which lie on the surface and attract the eye of the casual observer. This is one of those fundamental difficulties which have underlain and troubled the economic analysis of past times. Its full significance is perhaps not yet generally recognized, and much more work may need to be done before it is fully mastered. The new analysis is endeavoring gradually and tentatively to bring over into economics, as far as the widely different nature of the material will allow, those methods of the science of small increments, commonly called the differential calculus, to which man owes directly or indirectly the greater part of control that he has obtained in recent times over physical nature. It is still in its infancy, it has no dogma and no standard of orthodoxy. It has not yet had time to obtain a perfectly settled terminology, and some of the differences as to the best use of terms and other subordinate matters are but a sign of healthy life. In fact, however, there is a remarkable harmony and agreement on essentials among those who are working constructively by the new method, and especially among such of them that have served an apprenticeship in the simpler and more definite, and therefore more advanced, problems of physics. Ere another generation has passed, its dominion over that limited but important field of economic inquiry to which it is appropriate will probably be no longer in dispute. My wife has aided and advised me at every stage of successive editions of this volume. Each one of them owes a great deal to her suggestion, her care, and her judgment. Dr. Keynes and Mr. L. Price read through the proofs of the first edition, and helped me greatly. Mr. A. W. Flux has done much for me. Among the many who have helped me on special points, in some cases in regard to more than one edition, I would specially mention Professors Ashley, Cannon, Edgeworth, Haverfield, Pigou, and Tossig, Dr. Barry, Mr. C. R. Fay, and the late Professor Sidgwick. End of the preface to the 8th edition. Principles of Economics, Book 1, by Alfred Marshall.
Chapter 1 of Principles of Economics, Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 1, by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 1. Introduction. 1. Political economy, or economics, is a study of mankind and the ordinary business of life. It examines that part of individual and social action which is most closely connected with the attainment and with the use of the material requisites of well-being. Thus, it is on the one side a study of wealth, and on the other, and more important side, a part of the study of man. For man's character has been molded by his everyday work and the material resources which he thereby procures, more than by any other influence, unless it be that of his religious ideals. And the two great forming agencies of the world's history have been the religious and the economic. Here and there the ardor of the military or the artistic spirit has been for a while predominant, but religious and economic influences have nowhere been displaced from the front rank, even for a time, and they have nearly always been more important than all others put together. Religious motives are more intense than economic, but their direct action seldom extends over so large a part of life. For the business by which a person earns his livelihood generally fills his thoughts during by far the greater part of those hours in which his mind is at its best. During them, his character is being formed by the way in which he uses his faculties in his work, by the thoughts and the feelings which it suggests, and by his relations to his associates in work, his employers or his employees. And very often, the influence exerted on a person's character by the amount of his income is hardly less, if it is less, than that exerted by the way in which it is earned. It may make little difference to the fullness of life of a family whether its yearly income is £1,000 or £5,000, but it makes a very great difference whether the income is £30 or £150, for with £150 the family has, with £30 it has not, the material conditions of a complete life. It is true that in religion, in the family affections, and in friendship, even the poor may find scope for many of those faculties which are the source of the highest happiness. But the conditions which surround extreme poverty, especially in densely crowded places, tend to deaden the higher faculties. Those who have been called the residuum of our large towns have little opportunity for friendship. They know nothing of the decencies and the quiet, and very little even of the unity of family life. And religion often fails to reach them. No doubt their physical, mental, and moral ill health is partly due to other causes than poverty, but this is the chief cause. And in addition to the residuum, there are vast numbers of people both in town and country who are brought up with insufficient food, clothing, and house-room, whose education is broken off early in order that they may go to work for wages, who thenceforth are engaged, during long hours, in exhausting toil with imperfectly nourished bodies, and have therefore no chance of developing their higher mental faculties. Their life is not necessarily unhealthy or unhappy. Rejoicing in their affections towards God and man, and perhaps even possessing some natural refinement of feeling, they may lead lives that are far less incomplete than those of many who have more material wealth. But, for all that, their poverty is a great and almost unmixed evil to them. Even when they are well, their weariness often amounts to pain, while their pleasures are few, and when sickness comes, the suffering caused by poverty increases tenfold. And, though a contented spirit may go far towards reconciling them to these evils, there are others to which it ought not to reconcile them. Overworked and undertaught, weary and careworn, without quiet and without leisure, they have no chance of making the best of their mental faculties. Although, then, some of the evils which commonly go with poverty are not its necessary consequences, yet, broadly speaking, the destruction of the poor is their poverty, and the study of the causes of poverty is the study of the causes of the degradation of a large part of mankind. 2. Slavery was regarded by Aristotle as an ordinance of nature, and so probably was it by the slaves themselves in olden time. The dignity of man was proclaimed by the Christian religion. It has been asserted with increasing vehemence during the last 100 years, but only through the spread of education during quite recent times are we beginning to feel the full import of the phrase. Now at last we are setting ourselves seriously to inquire whether it is necessary that there should be any so-called lower classes at all. That is, whether there need be large numbers of people doomed from their birth to hard work in order to provide for others the requisites of a refined and cultured life, while they themselves are prevented by their poverty and toil from having any share or part in that life. The hope that poverty and ignorance may gradually be extinguished derives indeed much support from the steady progress of the working classes during the 19th century. The steam engine has relieved them of much exhausting and degrading toil. Wages have risen, education has been improved and become more general. The railway and the printing press have enabled members of the same trade in different parts of the country to communicate easily with one another and to undertake and carry out broad and far-seeing lines of policy, while the growing demand for intelligent work has caused the artisan classes to increase so rapidly that they now outnumber those whose labor is entirely unskilled. A great part of the artisans have ceased to belong to the lower classes in the sense in which the term was originally used, and some of them already lead a more refined and noble life than did the majority of the upper classes even a century ago. This progress has done more than anything else to give practical interest to the question whether it is really impossible that all should start in the world with a fair chance of leading a cultured life, free from the pains of poverty and the stagnating influences of excessive mechanical toil. And this question is being pressed to the front by the growing earnestness of the age. The question cannot be fully answered by economic science, for the answer depends partly on the moral and political capabilities of human nature, and on these matters the economist has no special means of information. He must do as others do, and guess as best he can. But the answer depends in a great measure upon facts and inferences which are within the province of economics, and this it is which gives to economic studies their chief and their highest interest. 3. It might have been expected that a science, which deals with questions so vital for the well-being of mankind, would have engaged the attention of many of the ablest thinkers of every age, and be now well advanced towards maturity. But the fact is that the number of scientific economists has always been small relatively to the difficulty of the work to be done, so that the science is still almost in its infancy. One cause of this is that the bearing of economics on the higher well-being of man has been overlooked. Indeed, a science which has wealth for its subject matter is often repugnant at first sight to many students, for those who do most to advance the boundaries of knowledge seldom care much about the possession of wealth for its own sake. But a more important cause is that many of those conditions of industrial life and of those methods of production, distribution, and consumption with which modern economic science is concerned are themselves only of recent date. It is indeed true that the change in substance is in some respects not so great as the change in outward form, and much more of modern economic theory than at first appears can be adapted to the conditions of backward races. But unity in substance, underlying many varieties of form, is not easy to detect, and changes in form have had the effect of making writers in all ages profit less than they otherwise might have done by the work of their predecessors. The economic conditions of modern life, though more complex, are in many ways more definite than those of earlier times. Business is more clearly marked off from other concerns. The rights of individuals as against others and as against the community are more sharply defined, and above all, the emancipation from custom and the growth of free activity, of constant forethought and restless enterprise, have given a new precision and a new prominence to the causes that govern the relative values of different things and different kinds of labor. 4. It is often said that the modern forms of industrial life are distinguished from the earlier by being more competitive. But this account is not quite satisfactory. The strict meaning of competition seems to be the racing of one person against another, with special reference to bidding for the sale or purchase of anything. This kind of racing is no doubt both more intense and more widely extended than it used to be, but it is only a secondary, and one might almost say an accidental consequence from the fundamental characteristics of modern industrial life. There is no one term that will express these characteristics adequately. They are, as we shall presently see, a certain independence and habit of choosing one's own course for oneself, a self-reliance, a deliberation and yet a promptness of choice and judgment, and a habit of forecasting the future and of shaping one's course with reference to distant aims. They may and often do cause people to compete with one another, but on the other hand they may tend, and just now indeed they are tending, in the direction of cooperation and combination of all kinds, good and evil. But these tendencies towards collective ownership and collective action are quite different from those of earlier times, because they are the result not of custom, not of any passive drifting into association with one's neighbours, but of free choice by each individual of that line of conduct which after careful deliberation seems to him the best suited for attaining his ends, whether they are selfish or unselfish. The term competition has gathered about it evil savour, and has come to imply a certain selfishness and indifference to the well-being of others. Now it is true that there is less deliberate selfishness in early than in modern forms of industry, but there is also less deliberate unselfishness. It is deliberateness, not selfishness, that is the characteristic of the modern age. For instance, while custom in a primitive society extends the limits of the family and prescribes certain duties to one's neighbours which fall into disuse in a later civilization, it also prescribes an attitude of hostility to strangers. In a modern society, the obligations of family kindness become more intense, though they are concentrated on a narrower area, and neighbours are put more nearly on the same footing with strangers. In ordinary dealings with both of them, the standard of fairness and honesty is lower than in some of the dealings of a primitive people with their neighbours, but it is much higher than in their dealings with strangers. Thus it is the ties of neighbourhood alone that have been relaxed. The ties of family are in many ways stronger than before. Family affection leads to much more self-sacrifice and devotion than it used to do, and sympathy with those who are strangers to us is a growing source of a kind of deliberate unselfishness that never existed before the modern age. That country which is the birthplace of modern competition devotes a larger part of its income than any other to charitable uses, and spent 20 millions on purchasing the freedom of the slaves in the West Indies. In every age, poets and social reformers have tried to stimulate the people of their own time to a nobler life by enchanting stories of the virtues of the heroes of old. But neither the records of history nor the contemporary observation of backward races, when carefully studied, give any support to the doctrine that man is on the whole harder and harsher than he was, or that he was ever more willing than he is now to sacrifice his own happiness for the benefit of others in cases where custom and law have left him free to choose his own course. Among races whose intellectual capacity seems not to have developed in any other direction, and who have none of the originating power of the modern businessman, there will be found many who show an evil sagacity in driving a hard bargain in a market, even with their neighbours. No traders are more unscrupulous in taking advantage of the necessities of the unfortunate than are the corn dealers and money lenders of the East. Again, the modern era has undoubtedly given new openings for dishonesty and trade. The advance of knowledge has discovered new ways of making things appear other than they are, and has rendered possible many new forms of adulteration. The producer is now far removed from the ultimate consumer, and his wrongdoings are not visited with the prompt and sharp punishment which falls on the head of a person who, being bound to live and die in his native village, plays a dishonest trick on one of his neighbours. The opportunities for knavery are certainly more numerous than they were, but there is no reason for thinking that people avail themselves of a larger proportion of such opportunities than they used to do. On the contrary, modern methods of trade imply habits of trustfulness on the one side, and a power of resisting temptation to dishonesty on the other, which do not exist among a backward people. Instances of simple truth and personal fidelity are met with under all social conditions, but those who have tried to establish a business of modern type in a backward country find that they can scarcely ever depend on the native population for filling posts of trust. It is even more difficult to dispense with imported assistance for work which calls for a strong moral character than for that which requires great skill and mental ability. Adulteration and fraud in trade were rampant in the Middle Ages to an extent that is very astonishing when we consider the difficulties of wrongdoing without detection at that time. In every stage of civilization in which the power of money has been prominent, poets in verse and prose have delighted to depict a past truly golden age, before the pressure of mere material gold had been felt. Their idyllic pictures have been beautiful and have stimulated noble imaginations and resolves, but they have had very little historical truth. Small communities with simple wants, for which the bounty of nature has made abundant provision, have indeed sometimes been nearly free from care about their material needs, and have not been tempted to sordid ambitions. But whenever we can penetrate to the inner life of a crowded population, under primitive conditions in our own time, we find more want, more narrowness, and more hardness than was manifest at a distance, and we never find a more widely diffused comfort alloyed by less suffering than exists in the Western world today. We ought therefore not to brand the forces which have made modern civilization by a name which suggests evil. It is perhaps not reasonable that such a suggestion should attach to the term competition, but in fact it does. In fact, when competition is arraigned, its antisocial forms are made prominent, and care is seldom taken to inquire whether there are not other forms of it, which are so essential to the maintenance of energy and spontaneity that their cessation might probably be injurious on the balance to social well-being. The traders or producers who find that a rival is offering goods at a lower price than will yield them a good profit are angered at his intrusion and complain of being wronged, even though it may be true that those who buy the cheaper goods are being wronged, even though it may be true that those who buy the cheaper goods are in greater need than themselves, and that the energy and resourcefulness of their rival is a social gain. In many cases, the regulation of competition is a misleading term that veils the formation of a privileged class of producers who often use their combined force to frustrate the attempts of an able man to rise from a lower class than their own. Under the pretext of repressing antisocial competition, they deprive him of the liberty of carving out for himself a new career, where the services rendered by him to the consumers of the commodity would be greater than the injuries that he inflicts on the relatively small group which objects to his competition. If competition is contrasted with energetic cooperation in unselfish work for the public good, then even the best forms of competition are relatively evil, while its harsher and meaner forms are hateful. And in a world in which all men were perfectly virtuous, competition would be out of place, but so also would be private property and every form of private right. Men would think only of their duties, and no one would desire to have a larger share of the comforts and luxuries of life than his neighbours. Strong producers could easily bear a touch of hardship, so they would wish that their weaker neighbours, while producing less, should consume more. Happy in this thought, they would work for the general good with all the energy, the inventiveness, and the eager initiative that belonged to them, and mankind would be victorious in contest with nature at every turn. Such is the golden age to which poets and dreamers may look forward. But in the responsible conduct of affairs, it is worse than folly to ignore the imperfections which still cling to human nature. History in general, and especially the history of socialistic ventures, shows that ordinary men are seldom capable of pure ideal altruism for any considerable time together, and that the exceptions are to be found only when the masterful fervour of a small band of religious enthusiasts makes material concerns to count for nothing in comparison with the higher faith. No doubt men, even now, are capable of much more unselfish service than they generally render, and the supreme aim of the economist is to discover how this latent social asset can be developed most quickly and turned to account most wisely. But he must not decry competition in general without analysis. He is bound to retain a neutral attitude towards any particular manifestation of it until he is sure that, human nature being what it is, the restraint of competition would not be more antisocial in its working than the competition itself. We may conclude, then, that the term competition is not well suited to describe the special characteristics of industrial life in the modern age. We need a term that does not imply any moral qualities, whether good or evil, but which indicates the undisputed fact that modern business and industry are characterized by more self-reliant habits, more forethought, more deliberate and free choice. There is not any one term adequate for this purpose, but freedom of industry and enterprise, or more shortly, economic freedom, points in the right direction, and it may be used in the absence of a better. Of course, this deliberate and free choice may lead to a certain departure from individual freedom when cooperation or combination seems to offer the best route to the desired end. The questions how far these deliberate forms of association are likely to destroy the freedom in which they had their origin, and how far they are likely to be conducive to the public weal, lie beyond the scope of the present volume. 5. This introductory chapter was followed in earlier editions by 2 short sketches, the one related to the growth of free enterprise, and generally of economic freedom, and the other to the growth of economic science. They have no claim to be systematic histories, however compressed. They aim only at indicating some landmarks on the routes by which economic structure and economic thought have travelled to their present position. They are now transferred to appendices A and B at the end of this volume, partly because their full drift can best be seen after some acquaintance has been made with the subject matter of economics, and partly because in the 20 years which have elapsed since they were first written, public opinion as to the position which the study of economic and social science should hold in a liberal education has greatly developed. There is less need now than formerly to insist that the economic problems of the present generation derive much of their subject matter from technical and social changes that are of recent date, and that their form as well as their urgency assume throughout the effective economic freedom of the mass of the people. The relations of many ancient Greeks and Romans with the slaves of their households were genial and humane. But even in Attica, the physical and moral well-being of the great body of the inhabitants was not accepted as a chief aim of the citizen. Ideals of life were high, but they concerned only a few, and the doctrine of value, which is full of complexities in the modern age, could then have been worked out on a plan, such as could be conceived today only if nearly all manual work were superseded by automatic machines which required merely a definite allowance of steam power and materials, and had no concern with the requirements of a full citizen's life. Much of modern economics might indeed have been anticipated in the towns of the Middle Ages, in which an intelligent and daring spirit was for the first time combined with patient industry. But they were not left to work out their career in peace, and the world had to wait for the dawn of the new economic era till a whole nation was ready for the ordeal of economic freedom. England especially was gradually prepared for the task, but towards the end of the 18th century the changes, which had so far been slow and gradual, suddenly became rapid and violent. Mechanical inventions, the concentration of industries, and a system of manufacturing on a large scale for distant markets broke up the old traditions of industry and left everyone to bargain for himself as best he might, and at the same time they stimulated an increase of population for which no provision had been made beyond standing room in factories and workshops. Thus free competition, or rather freedom of industry and enterprise, was set loose to run, like a huge untrained monster, its wayward course. The abuse of their new power by able but uncultured businessmen led to evils on every side. It unfitted mothers for their duties, it weighed down the children with overwork and disease, and in many places it degraded the race. Meanwhile, the kindly meant recklessness of the poor law did even more to lower the moral and physical energy of Englishmen than the hard-hearted recklessness of the manufacturing discipline, for by depriving the people of those qualities which would fit them for the new order of things, it increased the evil and diminished the good caused by the advent of free enterprise. And yet the time at which free enterprise was showing itself in an unnaturally harsh form was the very time in which economists were most lavish in their praises of it. This was partly because they saw clearly what we of this generation have in a great measure forgotten, the cruelty of the yoke of custom and rigid ordinance which it had displaced, and partly because the general tendency of Englishmen at the time was to hold that freedom in all matters political and social was worth having at every cost, except the loss of security. But partly also it was that the productive forces which free enterprise was giving to the nation were the only means by which it could offer a successful resistance to Napoleon. Economists therefore treated free enterprise not indeed as an unmixed good, but as a less evil than such regulation as was practicable at the time. Adhering to the lines of thought that had been started chiefly by medieval traders and continued by French and English philosophers in the latter half of the 18th century, Ricardo and his followers developed a theory of the action of free enterprise, or as they said, free competition, which contained many truths that will be probably important so long as the world exists. Their work was wonderfully complete within the narrow area which it covered, but much of the best of it consists of problems relating to rent and the value of corn, problems on the solution of which the fate of England just then seemed to depend, but many of which, in the particular form in which they were worked out by Ricardo, have very little direct bearing on the present state of things. A good deal of the rest of their work was narrowed by its regarding too exclusively the peculiar condition of England at that time, and this narrowness has caused a reaction, so that now, when more experience, more leisure, and greater material resources have enabled us to bring free enterprise somewhat under control, to diminish its power of doing evil and increase its power of doing good, there is growing up among many economists a sort of spite against it. Some even incline to exaggerate its evils, and attribute to it the ignorance and suffering which are the results either of tyranny and oppression in past ages, or of the misunderstanding and mismanagement of economic freedom. Intermediate between these two extremes are the great body of economists who, working on parallel lines in many different countries, are bringing to their studies an unbiased desire to ascertain the truth, and a willingness to go through with the long and heavy work by which alone scientific results of any value can be obtained. Varieties of mind, of temper, of training, and of opportunities lead them to work in different ways, and to give their chief attention to different parts of the problem. All are bound more or less to collect and arrange facts and statistics relating to past and present times, and all are bound to occupy themselves more or less with analysis and reasoning on the basis of those facts which are ready at hand. But some find the former task the more attractive and absorbing, and others the latter. This division of labor, however, implies not opposition, but harmony of purpose. The work of all adds something or other to that knowledge which enables us to understand the influences exerted on the quality and tone of man's life by the manner in which he earns his livelihood, and by the character of that livelihood. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of The Principle of Economics, Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. The Principle of Economics, Book 1, by Alfred Marshall, Chapter 2. The Substance of Economics. Economics is the study of men as they live and move and think in the ordinary business of life, but it concerns itself chiefly with those motives which affect, most powerfully and steadily, man's conduct in the business part of his life. Everyone who is worth anything carries his higher nature with him into business, and, there as elsewhere, he is influenced by his personal affections, by his conceptions of duty and his reverence for high ideals. And it is true that the best energies of the ablest inventors and organizers of improved methods and appliances are stimulated by a noble emulation more than by any love of wealth for its own sake. But, for all that, the steadiest motive to ordinary business work is the desire for pay, which is the material reward of work. The pay may be on its way to be spent selfishly or unselfishly, for noble or base ends, and here the variety of human nature comes into play. But the motive is supplied by a definite amount of money, and it is this definite and exact measurement of the steadiest motives in business life which has enabled economics far to outrun every other branch of the study of man. Just as the chemist's fine balance has made chemistry more exact than most other physical sciences, so this economics balance, rough and imperfect as it is, has made economics more exact than any other branch of social science. But of course economics cannot be compared with the exact physical sciences, for it deals with the ever-changing and subtle forces of human nature. The advantage which economics has over other branches of social science appears then to arise from the fact that its special field of work gives rather larger opportunities for exact methods than any other branch. It concerns itself chiefly with those desires, aspirations, and other affections of human nature, the outward manifestations of which appear as incentives to action in such a form that the force or quantity of the incentive can be estimated and measured with some approach to accuracy, and which therefore are in some degree amenable to treatment by scientific machinery. An opening is made for the methods and the tests of science as soon as the force of the person's motives, not the motives themselves, can be approximately measured by the sum of money which he will just give up in order to secure a desired satisfaction, or again by the sum which is just required to induce him to undergo a certain fatigue. It is essential to note that the economist does not claim to measure any affection of the mind itself, or directly, but only indirectly through its effect. No one can compare and measure accurately against one another even his own mental states at different times, and no one can measure the mental states of another at all except indirectly and conjecturally by their effects. Of course, various affections belong to man's higher nature and others to his lower, and are thus different in kind. But even if we confine our attention to mere physical pleasures and pains of the same kind, we find that they can only be compared indirectly by their effects. In fact, even this comparison is necessarily to some extent conjectural, unless they occur to the same person at the same time. For instance, the pleasures which two persons derive from smoking cannot be directly compared, nor can even those which the same person derives from it at different times. But if we may find a man in doubt whether to spend a few pence on a cigar, or a cup of tea, or on riding home instead of walking home, then we may follow ordinary usage, and say that he expects from them equal pleasures. If then we wish to compare even physical gratifications, we must do it not directly, but indirectly by the incentives which they afford to action. If the desires to secure either of two pleasures will induce people in similar circumstances each to do just an hour's extra work, or will induce men in the same rank of life, and with the same means, each to pay a shilling for it, we then may say that those pleasures are equal for our purposes, because the desires for them are equally strong incentives to action for persons under similar conditions. Thus measuring a mental state, as men do in ordinary life, by its motor force or the incentive which it affords to action, no new difficulty is introduced by the fact that some of the motives of which we have to take account belong to man's higher nature, and others to his lower. For suppose that a person, whom we saw doubting between several little gratifications for himself, had thought after a while of a poor invalid whom he would pass on his way home, and had spent some time in making up his mind whether he would choose a physical gratification for himself, or would do a kindly act and rejoice in another's joy. As his desires turned now towards the one, now to the other, there would be change in the quality of his mental states, and the philosopher is bound to study the nature of the change. But the economist studies mental states rather through their manifestations than in themselves, and if he finds they afford evenly balanced incentives to action, he treats them prima facie as for his purpose equal. He follows indeed in a more patient and thoughtful way, and with greater precautions, what everybody is doing every day in ordinary life. He does not attempt to weigh the real value of the higher affections of our nature against those of our lower. He does not balance the love for virtue against the desire for agreeable food. He estimates the incentives to action by their effects just in the same way as people do in common life. He follows the course of ordinary conversation, differing from it only in taking more precautions to make clear the limits of his knowledge as he goes. He reaches his provisional conclusions by observations of men in general, under given conditions, without attempting to fathom the mental and spiritual characteristics of individuals. But he does not ignore the mental and spiritual side of life. On the contrary, even for the narrower uses of economic studies, it is important to know whether the desires which prevail are such as will help build a strong and righteous character. And in the broader uses of those studies, when they are being applied to practical problems, the economist, like everyone else, must concern himself with the ultimate aims of man, and take account of differences in real value between gratifications that are equally powerful incentives to action, and have therefore equal economic measures. A study of these measures is only the starting point of economics, but it is the starting point. There are several other limitations of the measurement of motive by money to be discussed. The first of these arises from the necessity of taking account of the variations in the amount of pleasure or other satisfaction represented by the same sum of money to different persons and under different circumstances. A shilling may be a measure of greater pleasure or other satisfaction at one time than at another, even for the same person, because money may be more plentiful with him, or because his sensibility may vary, and persons whose antecedents are similar, and who are outwardly like one another, are often affected in very different ways by similar events. When, for instance, a band of city school children are sent out for a day's holiday in the country, it is probable that no two of them derive from it enjoyment exactly the same in kind, or equal in intensity. The same surgical operation causes different amounts of pain to different people. Of two parents who are, so far as we can tell, equally affectionate, one will suffer much more than the other from loss of a favorite son. Some who are not very sensitive generally are yet specially susceptible to particular kinds of pleasure and pain, while differences in nature and education make one man's total capacity for pleasure or pain much greater than another's. It would therefore not be safe to say that any two men with the same income derive equal benefit from its use, or that they would suffer equal pain from the same diminution of it. Although when a tax of £1 is taken from each of the two persons having an income of £300 a year, each will give up that £1 worth of pleasure or other satisfaction. That is, each will give up what is measured to him by just £1, yet the intensities of the satisfaction given up may not be nearly equal. Nevertheless, if we take averages sufficiently broad to cause the personal peculiarities of individuals to counterbalance one another, the money which people of equal incomes will give to obtain a benefit or avoid an injury is a good measure of the benefit or injury. If there are 1,000 persons living in Sheffield, and another 1,000 in Leeds, each with about £100 a year, and a tax of £1 is levied on all of them, we may be sure that the loss of pleasure or other injury which the tax will cause in Sheffield is of about equal importance with that which it will cause in Leeds, and anything that increased all the incomes by £1 would